think you got him.
God of War is a lot of things. A sequel done right, the reboot of a legendary franchise, the return of an iconic character. But above all else, God of War is one of the greatest virtual adventures I've ever had the pleasure of embarking on. Like Oblivion, Ocarina of Time, and The Witcher 3, my journey with Kratos and Atreus has been far more than just another game. It's presented me with an experience that feels time and time again like a genuine adventure. The kind that is almost completely unpredictable from start to finish. Every path, every corner I turn, filled with new encounters, new discoveries, and new memories just waiting to be made. That concept, the concept of a genuine adventure, I think is very rarely found in games. All games present us with an adventure, but few of them create an adventure that exists in such a state that it feels as honest to goodness as it can possibly get. Like, it feels as real as it can possibly get while still being a piece of medium that we experience on a flat screen. This isn't virtual reality. We're transported there because of the execution of all of the little details and all of the larger pieces that make up that world that adventure exists within. Now, this also makes God of War one of the most difficult games I have ever talked about here on the channel. Maybe not the most difficult, but it's up there with talking about The Witcher 3, talking about games that weren't just special to a large number of people, but that I found very special to me for specific reasons. And that is why I think God of War is so special, right? Just about every review I've read, everyone I've talked to who has played it has came away with a similar but slightly different representation of why God of War has been so special to them. So if you're seeing 10 out of 10s and all these crazy reviews everywhere, I think this is just an instance where the game absolutely deserves those scores and absolutely deserves that praise because of how special it actually is to so many different people for, again, similar but also different reasons. So that's why we're doing things the way we're doing them today. I don't really plan on showing a lot of footage of the game, maybe a little bit here and there with some simple combat, but God of War is an adventure in a way that I think it can be genuinely spoiled very easily. And that's how I feel about a lot of games. You guys know I'm like the anti-spoiler guy when it comes to games like this one. Like The Witcher 3, I didn't want to show off a lot of footage. Fortunately, The Witcher 3 has a lot of just downtime where you can just like show exploration. In the case of God of War, there is some of that, but God of War is so well curated in its open world environment that even the little like bits and pieces you find there feel so special that I don't want to share them. Like each and every side quest, each and every piece of lore is its own beautiful little mystery just waiting to be unfolded before your eyes, often through puzzle solving or open world exploration. And again, I wouldn't want to spoil any of that. So this is the best way to talk about God of War. This is the way we're going to do it. We're also not going to go excessively deep into every area of the game. We're going to hit on the larger sort of overarching vibe and feel and experience that is God of War. We will talk about combat, talk about world design, but again, I could go deeper on all of these things. That's just the sort of game that God of War is. We're going to stay on the shallow end and tread in careful waters as best as we possibly can. Where to start, though? That's a big question. I actually think I want to start with combat in God of War, because combat sort of made up everything that God of War was before it became the God of War that we now know. And that's really another spectacular thing about this experience. If you grew up playing God of War like I did, you're going to find yourself in something that feels quite new. Like, it's still God of War because you're Kratos, but the camera angle, just the way the entire game is presented, the story it's telling is so different that there's no way for you to really look back at your past God of War experiences and predict what's going to happen in this God of War. And that's another part of this game being so unpredictable, seeing, really being that grand journey, that grand adventure, if you will, that you just really can't try and figure it out before you get there. It has to unfold before you, it's a funny thing to say because Kratos is constantly reminding Atreus that they should focus on the here and now and not concern themselves with things that lie in the future that they can't predict, that are simply out of their reach. And that's the God of War experience here in 2018 in a nutshell. So combat in God of War is handled quite differently. Everything revolves around, I don't want to say everything revolves around multiple systems. The Leviathan Axe being the biggest one, your shield and hand-to-hand combat being the second biggest one, and the third piece of the puzzle being Atreus and his bow. All of these things blend together into the combat very well, and the game really quickly, I would say within the first 4 to 5 hours, opens up the potential for combat long-term to the player. So you might not have access to all of the movesets or all the things that lie within the skill tree, but you can instantly start to see how the combat can become very deep, and how it can become, I think, most importantly here, very player choice driven. There are multiple paths within the trees that you can go down at any given point in time, as long as you have the level requirements for the gear that's tied to those skill trees, as well as the experience that will alter the way you can play the game. And the same can be said for the gear and armor upgrade system, the rune system. There's a lot there. It's deep, it's customizable. That's the big thing. Again, without diving into it and just saying exactly what every little bit and piece does, it's very customizable. It allows you to build essentially the combat-ready Kratos you want to build, the combat-ready Atreus you want to build, and play to your strengths and weaknesses as an individual. Now, I chose to play on the second hardest difficulty, so not the hardest one, which has to be, like, brutal, because the second hardest difficulty is very, very challenging. It's no joke. In terms of just actual combat depth and difficulty, it is on par with a game like Dark Souls, although of course here you don't have to go back to bonfires and then kill everything to get there. You still do have to restart a lot of these fights from scratch, but it really, when it comes to that depth and that overall difficulty, I think it is on par with Dark Souls, and I'm not saying that just to draw a Dark Souls comparison, but to give value to the combat, because I think the depth that Dark Souls combat has, while also being kind of straightforward and simple, is what gives it its strength, on top of its difficulty and its challenge, and of course the risk of dying and having to do it all over again. You get a lot of that in God of War, although I would say that the combat and the flexibility you have in combat as an individual is far deeper than what you get in Dark Souls, at least with one specific weapon. Dark Souls, of course, has the benefit of having multiple weapons with different stances, so on and so forth. God of War kind of makes a mishmash of those concepts and puts it all behind Kratos' shield, his hand-to-hand combat, again, Atreus' bow, and the Leviathan Axe. The ability to use the Leviathan Axe to actually throw it and do ranged attacks with it is just a huge part of the mix-up game. You know, I could probably talk for like 45 minutes about combat in God of War, but just know it's deep, it's flexible, it's customizable for the individual player. If you're playing on a harder difficulty and you find yourself dying a lot, there are runes, there are things you can do to increase your ability to get health bursts, to get health stones from Atreus more often. You can really build, again, the combat-ready Kratos you want to build to take into any difficulty, any situation, if you will. Now, I do want to talk about difficulty for a second, one step further, because this game actually has a very customizable HUD, which I love. I love the fact that they gave us the ability to turn off all of the HUD if we wanted to. I'm playing just with the Witch's Compass, which is your compass, it's just what it's called, and nothing else. That means when I run into an enemy engagement, I don't know the difficulty level of the enemies. You know, there are certain enemy types from a visual perspective that are more difficult than others. There are just enemies straight out like the Vikings that regenerate health, that do very powerful attacks. There are enemies that will one-shot you in this game, no problemo. Those enemies tend to be purple tier. Now, I don't have my HUD on for their health bars, so I can't see the color tier of their difficulty, which means I have to wade into combat and just really judge their power level based on how much damage or how little damage I seem to be doing to them. So I might fight for 35 minutes to try and kill some enemies before realizing those guys are probably purple. I'm going to abandon this fight and come back to it. And that's kind of the strength of the game's open world, is that there are a lot of optional engagements you'll be able to go do that you can come back to at a later point in time. Well, I'm not powerful enough. I'll come back when my Leviathan Axe is leveled up again. I'll come back when I feel like I have a better understanding for the combat. But if you want, you can just stay there and try and win. You can kill things that are high level. The game doesn't make them unkillable, at least not in any instance I've run into. They just require a lot more time, a lot more effort, a lot more management of your health, of your abilities, of your, your parries. Everything comes into play when you start hitting on the higher level enemies. But that's what makes the combat so satisfying, because even when you strip away the very powerful enemy types and go just down to fighting basic Draugr, the combat is always enjoyable. There's always an opportunity to mix up multiple abilities, to make use of hand-to-hand and Leviathan Axe, and often the game requires this because hand-to-hand combat actually gives you a stronger chance to stun enemies. Stunning enemies can create a mix-up opportunity to bring the Leviathan Axe back into play, and of course you can even use Atreus long-term as you start to unlock different abilities with him to stun and shock and freeze enemies and things like that. So the combat depth knows no bounds. It is seriously good stuff here. I've seen some people trying to draw comparisons to like Rise and God Hand. No. This combat is leaps and bounds above that, not just in its difficulty potential, but again in player flexibility and the ability to customize how you engage in combat. It is seriously addictive and satisfying stuff, and the audiovisual presentation of it all is just good stuff, man. The Leviathan Axe is unbelievably satisfying. Hand-to-hand combat is brutal and meaty and chunky. The game feels amazing. Now, I will say that the lock-on camera, if you choose to use it, can be a bit finicky. I actually find that I enjoy playing with it off entirely a little bit more. I've experimented with the lock-on version of it. I believe you can have it on like all the time, or you can disable it entirely. There are moments when it works really well. There are moments when it doesn't work that well. There are actually upgrades you can make that allow you to sort of strafe multiple targets and have the camera work a little bit differently. So it's good. It's good enough. I think once you get comfortable with it, it feels fluid, it feels fast, and it does feel like you have to focus on your positioning. You know, this isn't OG God of War where you can sort of just dance 360 and everything's around you can see very far. You just have to kind of change the way you play. So if you go in expecting to play it like OG God of War, yeah, you're going to have trouble. But if you go in and realize where your camera perspective is and the importance of positioning yourself to multiple enemies, you're not ever going to get unnecessarily overwhelmed. You know, The Witcher 3 had a lot of issues with multi-target combat. Those issues aren't actually here in God of War. There's just an additional layer that you have to understand and get comfortable with when it comes to the targeting system and engaging with multiple targets before you can really feel fluid and natural in it. But once you do, it becomes very satisfying, very quick, and from there you can start to build mastery. You can start to understand all those abilities you're going to unlock, the usage of the different runes and their powers, and, you know, again, combining all of those things to take down higher level enemies or even lower level enemies that much quicker. Alright, where do we go next? Why don't we actually talk about a little bit about just the story arc and the relationship between Kratos and Atreus. Because this, I think, just ties into the rest of the game world, the adventure side of it, right? And there's one best metaphor I've been able to come up with to talk to other people about this. Imagine you are actually Frodo Baggins. You're not watching the film, you're not reading a book, those things don't exist. Well, films don't exist, books do. You are actually Frodo Baggins, and you're about to leave the Shire for the first time and set out on this grand adventure to deal with this ring. You have a basic idea of where you need to go, where the end of your journey lies, but you don't actually know 100% what's going to happen when you get there, and you definitely don't know what's going to happen along the way. That is the story of God of War. It's simple, but all of the developments that happen from point A to point B are where the game really starts to grow and expand its storytelling and introduce new characters and new opportunities to, again, create those sort of in-game memories. It's just really well handled, you know? It takes a basic idea of, we need to go here, and then opens up this endless stream of opportunities, you know, for storytelling along the way. And it works really, really well. And it does. It makes it feel like just a sort of grand old adventure. Like, playing God of War just reminds me so much of a good D&D campaign, you know, in that you start with a very basic concept, you know the end goal, and then everything that happens between the beginning and the end is unpredictable. You don't know. Only the DM, you know, your dungeon master knows. No one else knows. It's all up to him. You can, again, try and make educated guesses, but in a really unique adventure in D&D, it's going to be hard to predict what happens next. You know, you're just going to have to go with the flow. That's God of War. I think that's what makes the story and just the overall presentation of the game so superb, is that you just can't predict it. You're just along for the ride, and each and everything that you run into just feels so wonderful. Like a proper first time discovery, you know. For me, it's been able to capture something that I don't think a lot of games can capture, just that a very true sense of discovering something new. Even if a lot of the things you run into are seen in other games, Draugrs obviously aren't new, and ogres and trolls, these aren't new things. It's just the way they're presented to you that makes you feel like you're experiencing them for the very first time. And obviously, unique character design helps a lot too. So you see these trolls, you see the Draugr, and while they look like Draugr, they look like trolls, they are really well designed. They don't feel generic. They feel like they exist within the God of War world and not anywhere else. And again, that's just it's one of those many elements that exist within God of War that just stands to really demonstrate how well polished the whole experience is. Like, there's a superb layer of polish on everything in God of War that just brings the whole experience together and makes it as cohesive and as enjoyable as it is. It's a game that also never overwhelms you. So when we talk about the open world and exploring all these locations, right, there is a lot of stuff to go through, right? Like, each zone has its own sort of chart for, oh, here's how many things you have left to discover, here's how many things you have discovered, but it never feels overwhelming. It doesn't go full-blown open world, in that it doesn't just give you a bunch of monotonous tasks to complete for the sake of saying you completed them all. Each and every task, each and every discovery that you can find is directly tied into the game's lore, additional pieces of the game's storytelling, and the way that lore, the way that those additional pieces of storytelling are tied into Atreus as this sort of young scholar gives them more weight and more power than you typically find in a game that has you doing the same thing. Like, they take the concept of discovering lore, which is usually just used to be like, hey, here's some extra lore stuff, and they crank it up to 11 by, again, tying it into Atreus as a character. It's a very powerful thing, and the game does that constantly. It takes normal, oh, find this extra stuff, and ties it into the core gameplay in such a way that it feels more well executed than I have really ever seen in any game before. And that goes for looting. So looting these hidden chests and solving all these puzzles to get to the chests, to get to lore, that's the other big thing, right? Almost everything you find in the game, especially as you get further on, exists behind some sort of a puzzle, simple or complex. And that, again, just brings the world to life. Makes it an interesting place to be in, and it ensures that there's not really a lot of downtime. I mean, any downtime that you take is personal downtime for you to say, I don't want to rush through this, I want to take this entire world in. But the game is constantly asking you to use the Leviathan Axe to solve puzzles, to look at the environment, to find new locations that were hidden. It's a very active experience, to the point where you do have to kind of stop and just look around for a bit, because you will miss things. That's the thing, right? You're constantly doing things, but the game does want you to slow down. And I think as a player, I found myself in plenty of situations where I don't want to sprint. I don't want to sprint to the next objective. I don't want to sprint through this cavern. I want to walk, because not only do I not know what I might discover or find in terms of puzzles or hidden passageways, but you just want to take the world in. It's really that beautiful, that impressive. Now, I don't want to go too deep into the whole Kratos and Atreus relationship thing, because I think that's a big part of the story, and it very much contains a lot of spoiler-worthy discussion, but I think they did a good job. Kratos is an interesting character. To see Kratos in this light, you have this very brash and just gruff man. I've known people like him in the real world, although they weren't gods, and they couldn't lift, 50-ton rocks and punch people straight through concrete. But, it's strange. It's something I don't want to talk about right now, to be honest. Let's just leave it at that. But I like the relationship they build between the two. In terms of actual gameplay and just the overall experience of having Atreus at your side, it's really well done, to the point where Atreus never once feels like a pet or an additional NPC that's just kind of following you around. This is something that games struggle with often. When games try and give you a second character, especially when it's AI controlled, they often just feel like fodder. Like, they're just there. Atreus never feels like that. There are very basic interactions, vocal, verbal, and physical interactions that they give Atreus that bring him to life. The things he'll say after a fight. If you don't utilize him, if you don't call out for his arrows, for example, he might say something like, I feel like I could have helped more. And there's a lot of instances where he just simply asks Kratos, how did I do? And, Kratos will say, adequate. Or, nice shot, that was better, and you kind of see their bond slowly building as time goes on. But along the way, they're constantly interacting. The game is constantly reminding you of who these two characters are, their purpose in the game world, their purpose in your experience. They never neglect Atreus. They never neglect his ability to communicate with Kratos and allow him to slowly fall into the realm of fodder. And that's, I think, what makes him such a good AI, such a good part of the experience, where I don't want to refer to him as AI. I want to refer to him as another character. It's not as if you're playing two characters, which is something that a lot of games have done in the past as well. Especially, there's been a lot of unique sort of adventure games where they have you play two characters simultaneously. It's not like that at all. Atreus feels like his own person, his own existence. He is very much alongside of Kratos for this journey, and that creates, again, a very powerful connection between the two, both for the storytelling portion of the game as well as the actual gameplay portion of the game. Now, the world that is God of War, the God of War world in this case, is a very interesting one because, man, like, again, there's things I just don't want to say. There's things I don't want to say because they touch way too much on the spoiler side of things. Just know the world design itself is spectacular. It's beautiful. It is breathtaking. There's a large amount of diversity and variety across the multiple locations you'll visit. Again, everything is replayable in the sense that you can go back and explore places and rediscover things that maybe you missed on or that you weren't powerful enough to encounter before. And all of these things have so much meaning. Nothing ever feels like filler. And that's why I think we have a game that isn't going to last you 600 or 700 hours, but maybe 50 or 100, depending on, if you want 100% or not. It feels like an older game, like a game from the OG God of War era, in that reaching 100%, collecting everything feels really doable. It doesn't feel like this 5-month-long venture you're going to have to make in most modern open world games. It blends the good parts of modern open world games with the great parts of old, more linear game design, and creates an environment that you want to explore. You never feel overwhelmed. Open world games have a really bad habit of, within the first 3 hours, overwhelming you, where you're like, well, man, what the, dude? I got all this crap to collect. And that's the thing, it feels like crap. Never does that happen in God of War. And there's even a lot of lines of dialogue between Atreus and Kratos that encourage the player to explore. Atreus wants to explore. Kratos' mindset is, we only are acquiring what we need for the journey that lies ahead. Otherwise, we would not bother with this, blah, 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 right? So this idea that Atreus is like, come on, let's go exploring, it kind of encourages you to do so, and you never regret it. You never feel like you've went out of your way just for some stupid little thing. You're always given some sort of a reward, whether it's lore-based or actual, item-based. Goodies to upgrade your gear, your axe, so on and so forth. It is a really good game. It is a spectacular game. It is a beautiful piece of game design. And again, most importantly, to sum it up, it is a grand adventure. So if you're sitting there asking yourself, should I play God of War? I have a PlayStation 4. The real answer is absolutely yes. If you like games with combat, if you like games like this, unless you hate, I hate melee games, I hate adventure games, I hate fantasy games, there's no reason not to play God of War. It is a beautiful, beautiful experience that is so well crafted across just about every single piece of it that it's nearly impossible for me in my 30 plus hours now to dig out any real substantial flaws. If they're there, I can't bring myself to look hard enough to find them because I just don't see the value in finding them. There's so much other good stuff happening right before my eyes, so many things I want to experience, that there's no point to sit there and harp on small things that, I don't really like the way that was done. It's just, it is. I can see why people are giving it a 10 out of 10. It's difficult to find substantial or worth discussing flaws. And really, once again, to sum up this whole discussion, this 30-minute discussion, if you like going on grand adventures, if you like games that deliver an experience that comes across as a genuine adventure, you are going to love God of War. This falls in line for me with The Witcher 3, Oblivion, Ocarina of Time. I name those games because those are games that in my time playing games, since I was 4 or 5 years old, started playing games, struck me as proper adventures. They struck a chord with me that made me fall in love with them, that sort of allowed me to become lost in their worlds in a way that few other games ever have. That's God of War for me, and I think that's why so many other people are also finding this game so damn special. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you have any other questions, feel free to drop them down in the comment section below. I think at some point in the future we'll do sort of a spoiler cast for God of War and just talk about the characters and go more in depth with the world design. I'd like to actually do a lot of videos for this game, breaking down like the smaller details that I've ran into that I personally have found really breathtaking or really special, because that's just the sort of game God of War is. So if you'd like to see something like that, let me know down in the comment section below. Maybe slap that like button, hit me with the subscribe, and click that notification bell if you guys want more discussions like this, more content from me here on the channel. Go play God of War. I'll see you in the next one.
You have been brought here for a purpose, the most important task of your lives.